Princess Abe was born in 713 into the highest tier of the imperial court, the only child of Emperor Shōmu and Empress Kōken. She entered a palace already carved by shifting ambitions, where political favor moved in whispers, and the weight of religion grew heavier with each year. Her parents ruled during a time of profound instability. Smallpox outbreaks devastated the population, rice yields declined, and court factions splintered over land and law. In response, Emperor Shōmu leaned not on armies, but on temples. He poured state resources into Buddhist institutions, elevating monks into political prominence and reshaping the spiritual identity of the nation. Empress Kōken, herself a devout follower of the faith, mirrored this vision. Their rule became inseparable from Buddhism, not just as a belief system, but as a framework for governance. Princess Abe grew up watching the architecture of power shift from swords to sutras. She was not raised in the image of consorts or courtly ornaments. Instead, she was shaped by scrolls, scripture, and the expectation that she might one day inherit not just a throne, but a delicate political order bound by religious alliance. The court was not silent about her presence. As a woman in direct line for the throne, Abe stood outside traditional succession models, which relied on male heirs or regents. But with no brothers to rival her claim and no precedent strong enough to block it, the path remained open. She watched as her father abdicated in 749, the same year he completed the Great Buddha at Todai-ji, a monument not only to faith, but to centralized authority expressed through sacred imagery. When he stepped down, it was not to pass the throne to a general, nor to a nephew, but to her. Abe became Empress Kōken, one of only a few women in Japanese history to rule as a reigning monarch, not a consort or regent. Her ascension was not born of rebellion or upheaval. It came through lineage, planning, and the quiet willingness of others to maintain continuity rather than risk chaos. Yet her rule was never a blank slate. She inherited a court already structured by her parents' decisions, one where Buddhism had been entwined with state administration and where temples controlled growing tracts of land and influence. Her role became one of equilibrium. She was expected to hold the reforms in place, not question their foundations. The Daijokan, or Council of State, still operated under the Ritsuryo system of codified law, but its loyalties were increasingly tied to clerical figures rather than aristocratic lineages. As the Fujiwara clan continued to grow in wealth and ambition, Kōken's throne rested on fragile alliances. She had few political allies of her own and leaned heavily on institutional continuity to sustain legitimacy. Her early reign was marked by a calm surface, but beneath it, competing forces jostled: families who resented religious interference, monks who sought greater control, and civil officials who feared being displaced altogether. The Empress herself remained cautious, deliberate, and emotionally inaccessible to many of her contemporaries. She did not marry. She named no heir. She governed with the authority of one born into power, but always mindful that her presence disrupted precedent. Her mother, Empress Kōken, remained a towering figure in the background, still influential, still deeply involved in Buddhist patronage, and still a reminder that women could hold power if they aligned it with divine legitimacy. Kōken walked a careful line, reinforcing temple authority while maintaining formal oversight through the throne. This balance gave her reign a sense of steadiness, though it masked the growing friction between clerical ambition and aristocratic resistance. Empress Kōken's early years on the throne did not produce sweeping reforms of her own. Instead, she became a custodian of the structures laid before her. Her administration continued the compilation of historical records, legal codes, and temple registries. She endorsed religious projects without expanding them aggressively, and maintained court rituals that tied imperial legitimacy to the Buddhist cosmology her father had embraced. But her silence in reshaping the system was not passivity. It was strategy. The court was not stable enough for reinvention. What it needed was consistency, an image of control, and that, more than any bold decree, is what she provided. Yet as the years passed, the limitations of inherited policy became clearer. Tensions between the Fujiwara clan and the growing power of religious institutions strained her court. The absence of a male heir, the persistence of court rivalries, and the increasing demands from temple leaders formed an undercurrent of unresolved crisis. Kōken's rule was not the rule of a visionary seeking change. It was the rule of a woman navigating a throne left fragile by overlapping ambitions. Her early reign remained defined not by what she introduced, but by what she held in place. She neither abandoned the religious policies of her father, nor fully succumbed to the court factions that challenged them. Her authority rested in restraint, her power in patience. But the structures she protected were not inert. They shifted beneath her, slowly, until holding them still would no longer be enough. Kōken's reign unfolded within a political landscape where the boundaries between state and faith were not only thin, but deliberately obscured. Following in the path carved by her father, Emperor Shōmu, and her mother, Empress Kōken, she continued to elevate Buddhism as a governing force, less a private devotion than a public institution with imperial weight. At the heart of her strategy was not the construction of new monuments or the introduction of sweeping dogma, but the slow consolidation of Buddhist influence within the machinery of governance. She presided over sutra recitations, not as a passive participant, but as a ruler claiming divine proximity. These rituals, attended by ministers and monks alike, functioned as political theater, reinforcing the idea that her rule was sanctified by cosmic order. By associating herself with the sacred scripts and relics of Buddhism, she framed her authority as not only lawful, but spiritually ordained. This alignment with Buddhism extended beyond symbolism. Kōken continued the practice of granting state land to temples, particularly those affiliated with major sects centered in Nara. These grants did not merely enrich religious institutions, they displaced aristocratic control over land, diverting resources and labor away from traditional power bases and into the hands of monks loyal to the throne. The Fujiwara clan, whose influence had grown through careful placement of family members into imperial marriages and key court posts, began to see this trend not as biased governance, but as a redistribution of power they could not control. The temples, now economic forces in their own right, became political allies to Kōken, not through direct appointments, but through dependency. They owed their expansion to her authority, and in return, offered public rituals, written blessings, and silent support. The balance Kōken pursued was not without risk. Unlike Shinto, which was deeply embedded in clan lineage and local tradition, Buddhism arrived as a foreign system, its texts imported, its rites translated, its hierarchy outside native myth. Many aristocrats viewed its spread with suspicion, believing it diluted Japan's indigenous spiritual fabric. To those who clung to Shinto as a source of ancestral legitimacy, Kōken's Buddhist orientation signaled more than religious preference. It suggested a ruler who placed her power in the hands of foreign gods and foreign-born clergy. The resentment was quiet at first, layered in petitions, advisory letters, and ritual absences. But it grew more pointed as the temples amassed wealth, and as Kōken's court appointments increasingly bypassed traditional noble lineages in favor of those aligned with religious administration. Inside the palace, she maintained an image of harmony. Public rites honored both kami and Buddhas. Shrines continued to receive offerings. But the spiritual balance tilted year by year. She approved the copying of thousands of sutras at state expense, distributed temple appointments through the Council of State, and authorized new laws reinforcing the authority of monastic officials over land disputes. Her role blurred with that of a high priestess, not because she declared herself one, but because the structure of her governance left little separation. Her throne did not simply oversee religious life, it lived within it. Kōken's alignment with Buddhism also protected her from the gendered limitations of imperial tradition. As a woman, her reign was tolerated, but never fully welcomed by all members of the aristocracy. The sacred framing of her rule made challenge more difficult. To oppose her policies was to question not just a sovereign, but a ruler sanctified through the Dharma. Religion became her defense against claims of illegitimacy. It gave her language beyond bloodlines, rituals beyond regency, and allies beyond the court. But it also narrowed the path forward. With each temple grant and clerical appointment, she distanced herself from the political families that once underpinned the throne. And while the surface of court life held, the foundations beneath it were shifting toward a structure no longer centered on clan consensus, but on sacred decree. Dokyo entered the imperial court without fanfare, summoned not as a statesman or priest, but as a healer. In the early years of Empress Kōken's second reign, illness had begun to shadow her, whether physical, spiritual, or both remains uncertain. But what is clear is that Dokyo's arrival coincided with a turning point. A monk trained in the Hosso school of Buddhism, he had studied both religious doctrine and medicinal practice, and it was through this latter skill that he was first granted access to the Empress. His presence was justified through duty, not politics. But in a palace where proximity to power often mattered more than title, that distinction began to fade quickly. What began as private consultations expanded into long periods in her company, influence over court discussions, and eventually a presence at key administrative councils. His robes marked him as a servant of the Dharma, but his reach extended well beyond the temple walls. The speed of his rise unsettled the court. Ministers accustomed to navigating courtly etiquette and clan rivalry found themselves eclipsed by a man with no aristocratic lineage, no army, and no precedent. Dokyo did not seek alliances through marriage or blood. He moved through favor, through loyalty, and through the silent approval of the Empress. To many, this new axis of power was both unfamiliar and dangerous. His growing influence over Kōken seemed to erode the boundaries between religious devotion and imperial will. He advised on matters of governance, received audiences with visiting dignitaries and began to play a direct role in state decisions. Though he held no formal office at first, his word carried weight, and his presence became a fixture of court life. Whispers spread quickly that he had become her confidant, that he influenced her beyond reason, that her reliance on him was not only spiritual. The court, already strained by Kōken's previous reliance on Buddhist institutions, began to interpret Dokyo's rise as evidence of dangerous overreach, not by the throne, but by the temple. The Fujiwara clan, in particular, read his growing presence as a threat to hereditary governance. Where once succession and policy had been shaped by noble houses, they were now being shaped in private chambers by a monk who answered to no family but claimed access to higher truths. The court had long tolerated religious advisors, but Dokyo's integration into government shattered the illusion of separation. He did not offer sermons. He offered decisions. To Kōken, however, Dokyo filled a role no regent or nobleman had ever satisfied. He did not challenge her decisions. He did not maneuver for succession or court favor. His loyalty was personal and direct, anchored not in shared bloodlines or future inheritance, but in spiritual alignment and obedience. In a palace where nearly every official calculated their standing with an eye to dynasty, Dokyo stood apart. He owed his station entirely to her, and in return, she controlled the shape of his influence. This dynamic gave Kōken a form of control rarely available to female rulers, who were often forced to delegate power to male regents or heirs. With Dokyo, she had a voice she could direct, a proxy who did not seek to replace her. But the court could not accept this balance as stable. His rise triggered not only discomfort, but resistance. Senior officials began to exclude him from correspondence, delay approvals, and elevate rival clergy to temper his influence. These measures failed. Dokyo only grew more powerful, and in 764, he was formally appointed to the position of Daijo Daijin, Grand Minister of State. It was the highest secular office in the land, held now by a man with no secular roots. His new role blurred the final lines between temple and government. For the first time in Japanese history, a Buddhist monk held the reins of both spiritual and political administration, and he did so not through inheritance, but through favor. What had begun as healing had turned into authority, and the consequences of that shift would soon move beyond the palace itself. In 758, after nearly a decade on the throne, Empress Kōken abdicated. The act was framed as voluntary, an elegant transition of power to her cousin, Prince Oi, who ascended as Emperor Junnin. It was presented as orderly, even dutiful, a gesture of continuity, not retreat. But the court understood the arrangement differently. Kōken did not retire to a distant monastery or relinquish influence. She remained within the palace complex, kept her staff, and continued to issue orders through informal channels. The ceremonial transfer of power marked a shift in title, not in authority. The real lines of control remained blurred, and Junnin's reign began in the shadow of his predecessor's persistent presence. The decision to elevate Junnin had not emerged from widespread consensus. He was a capable prince, related by blood, but his claim lacked the weight of direct lineage from Empress Kōken or Emperor Shōmu. His appointment relied heavily on Kōken's favor. Without her public endorsement, his position would have been tenuous at best. Yet the elevation of a male sovereign served to placate factions within the court, especially those uneasy with prolonged female rule and the expanding influence of religious figures like Dokyo. In outward form, the court returned to orthodoxy, a man on the throne, a woman in retirement, and the clergy back to the periphery. But the outward form was deceptive. Kōken had not relinquished command. She had only changed its shape. In the years following her abdication, she remained deeply engaged in court affairs. Records show her continued involvement in bureaucratic appointments, land grants, and religious patronage. Though these actions were often attributed to imperial authority, they bore the mark of her preferences and priorities. Administrative documents circulated through her residence before reaching the Council of State. Even foreign envoys acknowledged her role, requesting audiences or deferring policy questions until her stance was known. Behind closed doors, Kōken operated not as a dowager, but as a parallel center of power. She consulted with senior monks, met with officials, and preserved control over the mechanisms of governance with a quiet efficiency that frustrated her nominal successor. For Emperor Junnin, the arrangement was untenable. He had the title but lacked autonomy. His attempts to assert independence, especially in matters of court appointments and land redistribution, were often stalled or reversed. Key officials continued to align with Kōken, either out of loyalty or caution. The Fujiwara clan, sensing the instability of the arrangement, began to position itself once again as a counterweight, urging the emperor to sever ties with the retired empress and reassert full sovereign authority. But Kōken remained immovable. Her proximity to the court, her control over the religious establishment, and her enduring political networks made her more than a symbolic figure. She was still, in practice, the empire's guide. As tensions deepened, the structure of power at court grew more fragmented. The appearance of continuity masked a brewing crisis, one in which legitimacy no longer flowed cleanly from throne to sovereign. The emperor issued commands, but their origin was often suspect. The retired empress no longer bore the crown, yet her will shaped the laws, the court, and the quiet rhythms of administration. It was a divided monarchy in all but name, and it would not remain stable for long. By the early 760s, the tension inside the court had hardened into something irreversible. Though Emperor Junnin occupied the throne in name, his actions remained limited by the invisible reach of his predecessor. Kōken had not only retained her influence, she had expanded it, increasingly relying on the Buddhist clergy and her inner circle of loyal administrators to counterbalance the formal channels of state. At the center of the emperor's dwindling authority stood one man who seemed willing to confront her directly, Fujiwara no Nakamaro. A veteran courtier and the most prominent member of the Fujiwara family at the time, Nakamaro had once enjoyed Kōken's trust. But as her reliance on Dokyo deepened and her refusal to step away from governance became more evident, Nakamaro repositioned himself. He tied his fortunes to Emperor Junnin, promoting him as the rightful sovereign and casting himself as the protector of a more traditional, aristocracy-led state. The alliance between Nakamaro and Junnin was not formalized through edict or public decree, but its effects were clear. Administrative control began to drift back into the emperor's grasp. Nakamaro issued a series of policy adjustments that reduced the authority of Buddhist institutions over land and tax matters. He elevated his own sons to key court positions and sought to marginalize those aligned with the retired empress. These moves were framed as bureaucratic reform, but in practice they were acts of political siege, designed to isolate Kōken and break the back of her support network. The Empress did not retaliate immediately. Her response, like much of her leadership, was patient, deliberate, and final. By 764, the struggle could no longer be contained within bureaucratic forms. Nakamaro, sensing that his position was becoming untenable, moved decisively. With the support of Emperor Junnin and several military officials, he attempted to assert full control over the court, planning to relocate the capital and formally strip Kōken of her remaining authority. But the effort collapsed before it fully materialized. The court bureaucracy, still deeply loyal to Kōken, refused to comply. Monastic forces, particularly those aligned with Dokyo, mobilized rapidly. Roads were blocked, orders were countermanded, communications were severed. There was no formal declaration of rebellion, no battles recorded in the countryside, but the machinery of Nakamaro's coup was dismantled in silence. The collapse was swift. Nakamaro and his sons were captured and executed. Emperor Junnin was exiled, his reign annulled in official records. Kōken returned to the throne, not as a ruler reclaiming lost power, but as a figure transformed. She adopted the regnal title Empress Shōtoku, invoking the memory of the earlier Prince Shōtoku, the revered Buddhist statesman who had once laid the intellectual foundation for Buddhist governance in Japan. Her second reign did not begin in fire or conquest, but in a bloodless, uncontested assertion of total authority. The Fujiwara clan, once the dominant political force in the capital, had been silenced, if not in voice, then in influence. The aristocracy, stunned by the failure of Nakamaro's revolt, retreated into caution. The throne no longer operated through compromise. It ruled through distance, ritual, and the implied threat of swift removal. For the first time in Japan's imperial history, a single figure held unchallenged power, not only as sovereign, but as sacred embodiment. Empress Shōtoku had no rivals, only silence. Empress Shōtoku's return to the throne in 764 was not framed as a restoration, but as a consecration. No longer merely Kōken, the daughter of imperial saints and steward of a fragile court, she now stood as a ruler who had outlived her rivals and rewritten the terms of imperial legitimacy. The name Shōtoku was not chosen lightly. It evoked Prince Shōtoku, the legendary figure who had introduced Buddhism as a central pillar of Japanese political identity over a century earlier. By invoking his memory, the Empress cast her reign not as a continuation, but as a sacred turning point. In doing so, she severed the expectations of gendered regency, hereditary alliances, and aristocratic approval. She ruled alone, without husband, son, or co-sovereign, and no one could stop her. The court adjusted under pressure, following the failure of Fujiwara, no Nakamaro's revolt. The surviving members of the Fujiwara clan kept their distance. The Council of State, traditionally the highest secular body in government, was gradually repopulated with figures loyal to Shōtoku and drawn from outside the dominant noble families. She placed increasing administrative weight in the hands of temple-affiliated bureaucrats, men trained in both Buddhist doctrine and civil law. These appointees brought with them not only religious conviction, but institutional loyalty to the Empress herself. Where previous emperors had balanced the interests of clans, court factions, and spiritual authorities, Shōtoku concentrated them. She did not distribute favor. She issued it through a singular point, her own will. Central to this transformation was the continued rise of Dokyo. Already the Grand Minister of State, he was elevated further to Hu, essentially the highest ecclesiastical title within the Buddhist hierarchy, translating loosely as Dharma King. This position had no precedent in Japanese statecraft. It gave Dokyo sweeping religious authority over the temple system, including doctrinal enforcement, clerical appointments, and ritual interpretation. But it also granted him an unofficial but undeniable seat beside the throne. Together, the empress and her monk built a system in which religious orthodoxy and imperial command became indistinguishable. Dokyo's influence permeated the legal apparatus. New edicts bore his imprint, subtly at first, then overtly. Temples gained expanded tax exemptions. Monastic courts received jurisdiction over land disputes in temple-held provinces. Legal codes began to reference Buddhist ethical frameworks, not merely state regulation. This shift did not go unnoticed. For many in the court, especially those of Shinto lineage, the transformation of the government into a quasi-theocratic regime was deeply unsettling. Traditional modes of governance, anchored in ritual, consensus, and clan negotiation, were increasingly bypassed. Decisions emerged fully formed, issued from the palace with religious justification and no space for appeal. Critics were removed, isolated, or silenced, not through violence, but through irrelevance. The court became a stage managed by the empress and her chosen circle. Attendance became symbolic. Policy was preordained. Yet even as she centralized power, Shōtoku remained careful in her presentation. Rituals continued, court calendars were maintained, and imperial functions observed. But the meaning behind them shifted. Where once the emperor had been a mediator between celestial and earthly order, Shōtoku positioned herself as the embodiment of both. Her public image became increasingly remote, even sacred. Audiences with her became rare. Decisions flowed from the throne without explanation. The role of sovereign was no longer political. It was metaphysical. Authority did not need to be defended. It needed only to be witnessed. Underneath this transformation lay the personal core of her governance. Shōtoku's court was not just restructured, it was rebuilt in her image. The few who held real power answered directly to her. Dokyo, for all his titles and public presence, remained dependent on her approval. Her policies, while wrapped in spiritual language, reflected a deeper instinct. The consolidation of control, not just as strategy, but as necessity. She had been challenged once. She had abdicated once. She would not allow it again. Her second reign became less about the management of a state and more about the preservation of a sovereign will, complete, indivisible, and untouchable. In 766, 2 years into Empress Shōtoku's second reign, a moment arrived that would unravel the carefully constructed alignment between sacred legitimacy and absolute rule. It began not with rebellion, but with acclaim. Dokyo, already elevated to the highest clerical position in the land, announced that the gods themselves had spoken. He declared that a divine oracle from the Usa Hachiman Shrine, one of the most revered Shinto sites in Japan, had revealed he was destined to become emperor. The announcement was unprecedented. No monk had ever ascended the throne, and certainly not one without imperial blood. The implications were staggering. If accepted, Dokyo's claim would overturn centuries of dynastic tradition and establish a new form of succession, one rooted not in lineage, but in divine selection. To the Empress's supporters, it was a logical extension of their theocratic model. To the rest of the court, it was heresy wrapped in ritual. The reaction was immediate and fractured. Within days, Shinto priests across the country issued quiet but firm objections. The Fujiwara clan, weakened but not erased, began mobilizing its influence among provincial governors and bureaucrats. Scholars and legal advisors submitted written protests, citing both history and law. Even members of the imperial family, long silent under Shōtoku's dominance, began to question the direction of her reign. At the center of the backlash stood the concept of precedent. The imperial throne had always rested on divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu through the imperial line. Dokyo's claim, though cloaked in religious authority, represented a rupture with that inheritance. It was not just unorthodox, it was unthinkable. The shrine at Usa, initially silent, soon issued a second oracle, this time through official channels. The message, delivered to the court by emissaries, rejected Dokyo's claim. It stated unequivocally that no one outside the imperial bloodline should ascend the throne. The pronouncement carried spiritual and political weight. Hachiman, the deity in question, was both a guardian of warriors and a symbol of ancestral continuity. His voice, as relayed by the shrine, carried the force of ancestral law. The court could not ignore it. Even those who had tolerated Shōtoku's religious governance could not follow her down this path. The office of emperor, once blurred by proximity to Buddhist hierarchy, now reasserted its native foundation through Shinto authority. The empress and her closest advisor had attempted to sanctify succession through revelation. The gods had answered and said no. The fallout was not dramatic, but it was decisive. Dokyo's ambitions stalled. His appointment to the throne, once rumored to be imminent, was never formalized. Instead, he remained cloistered within his existing roles, watched carefully by both court officials and temple networks. The empress, for the first time in years, found herself constrained, not by revolt, but by belief. Her own system of legitimacy had turned against her. The rituals she had used to rule were now being wielded by others to limit her. There was no confrontation, no edict of reversal, but the tone of court life shifted. Audiences grew more formal. Edicts less frequent. Opposition re-emerged not in defiance, but in the quiet assertion of inherited boundaries. Shōtoku had once fused her rule with religious power to insulate herself from challenge. Now that same structure had become a trap. The divine message from Hachiman revealed the limits of state-controlled spirituality. Belief could be shaped, but not owned. Ritual could justify power, but not replace tradition. She did not renounce her policies, nor did she remove Dokyo from office. But the structure she had built, rigid, centralized, and sacred, no longer expanded. It contracted. The vision of an empire, ruled through temple and throne in perfect unity, began to dim. Not through failure of strength, but through refusal of consent. The court had seen what total religious authority looked like. It had chosen something older instead. By 769, the weight of dissent against Dokyo had settled into permanence. He remained officially in office, holding titles few before him had ever claimed, but his reach had been clipped. His voice no longer echoed through the imperial court as it once had. The Hachiman Oracle had changed the terms of his presence. The spiritual justification for his authority had been revoked by the very system that had once sustained it. What remained was the raw structure of power. A monk still seated beside an aging empress, guarded by protocol, hemmed in by quiet hostility. The court no longer debated his legitimacy. It demanded his removal. Counselors, scholars, and members of the nobility submitted formal petitions urging his exile. Some framed it as a legal necessity, others as a religious correction. Many simply presented it as the only way forward. Yet Empress Shōtoku refused. She acknowledged the pressure but delayed the orders. She allowed discussions to unfold, allowed the court to posture. But she did not sign the decree. For years, Dokyo had served not only as her advisor, but as a buffer between herself and the aristocracy, a conduit for control, and perhaps something deeper. His exile would not simply mark the end of a failed experiment in shared governance. It would sever the last remaining thread of personal loyalty in a palace that had grown cold. She understood what his presence meant, both symbolically and strategically. But she also knew that the court was no longer hers to shape. The signs of her isolation accumulated quietly. Ceremonies once orchestrated by her office now proceeded with minimal participation. Officials who had once deferred to her now looked elsewhere for direction. Foreign dignitaries addressed their formal communique to imperial secretaries, rather than to the sovereign herself. The rituals of respect endured, but the reality behind them had shifted. Within the palace, decision-making grew diffuse. Ministries took independent action. Provincial governors responded to orders with delay, or not at all. The network of obedience that had once circled the empress like a ring of stone now appeared hollow. Despite this erosion, she held her ground. She neither surrendered the throne nor revoked Dokyo's authority. Instead, she governed in narrowing circles, consulting fewer advisors, issuing fewer edicts, and clinging to a form of rule that no longer moved the machinery around her. The formal structures remained intact. The illusion of sovereignty was carefully preserved. But the emotional center of her reign had withered. Those who had once served her with fervor now moved with calculation. Her resistance to banishing Dokyo was interpreted not as loyalty, but as weakness. The court no longer feared her will. It pitied her distance. Even Dokyo, though still outwardly composed, understood the change. He no longer made pronouncements or sought new appointments. He remained at her side, but offered little intervention. The confidence that had once defined his rise faded into silence. He too had become a relic of a reign that no longer held momentum. Yet still, Shōtoku did not abandon him. To exile him would be to admit the end of the world she had spent decades constructing, an empire where Buddhism defined authority, where obedience flowed through sanctity, and where her rule stood above lineage, beyond challenge. She delayed until delay was no longer viable. The calls grew stronger. The court no longer asked for action. It prepared for it. Her final year passed without ceremony, without rupture, without formal abdication. There was no rebellion, only resignation, unspoken, gradual, and complete. The woman who had once held an empire through patience now held only the last person who had never turned away. And soon, even that would be taken from her. In 770, Empress Shōtoku died in her early 50s, her body failing after years of quiet defiance and institutional retreat. She left behind no child, no husband, and no appointed successor. Her final months had been marked by stillness rather than ceremony. There were no final declarations, no sweeping reforms, no gestures to bind her memory to the state she had shaped. She left only a will, brief, unremarkable in tone, and silent on the matter of Dokyo. It did not name him. It did not defend him. It did not call for his protection or recall his service. Whether this omission was deliberate, coerced, or the product of physical weakness remains unknown. But it marked a final separation between sovereign and shadow, one that neither palace officials nor later historians would reverse. The court moved quickly. Within weeks, Dokyo was stripped of his titles and exiled to Shimotsuki province. There was no trial, no formal charge, no public explanation. The removal was surgical, precise, emotionless, and complete. The monk who had once dictated imperial policy was reduced overnight to a figure of suspicion, his name scrubbed from edicts, his writings sealed or destroyed. His exile was not only geographical, it was historical. The court erased his place in the narrative of power, reframing him as a momentary deviation rather than a central figure in a transformative reign. For the officials who had watched his rise with fear and resentment, his removal was less about punishment than restoration. With Shōtoku's death, they could resume a version of governance more familiar, more orthodox, and more manageable. Succession passed quietly to Emperor Konin, a distant relative of the imperial line who had remained peripheral during Shōtoku's rule. His selection was not controversial. He represented no faction. He carried no scandal. He was, in many ways, the perfect placeholder, a bridge back to tradition, unburdened by association with either the Buddhist theocracy or the Fujiwara excesses that had preceded it. The transition occurred without resistance. There was no instability, no political vacuum, no external threat. Despite the Empress's long effort to consolidate power around herself and her chosen circle, the court endured without her. The systems she had reshaped bent back into older forms with remarkable ease. Her reign had redefined sovereignty, but it had not replaced its foundations. In the months following her death, the court held the customary rituals. Offerings were made, prayers recited, but there was no canonization, no elevation to divine status, no temple was built in her name. Despite decades of promoting Buddhism as a pillar of rule, she was not immortalized by the institutions she had enriched. Her death brought silence, not reverence. Chronicles described her reign in careful language, acknowledging her authority without celebrating her vision. Where other emperors were praised for military victories or spiritual insight, Shōtoku was recorded in terms of continuity. Her reign had not collapsed the empire. It had preserved it. But the preservation was not remembered as triumph. It was remembered as interruption. And yet, she was not forgotten. Her influence lingered in structure, not sentiment. The restrictions placed on female succession after her reign were not legal accidents. They were deliberate responses to the fears her rule had awakened. No woman would ascend the Japanese throne again for nearly a millennium. The temples she supported continued to dominate land and labor, even as future emperors sought to restrain them. The memory of a monarch who had ruled alone, without heir or regent, became a cautionary thread in the imperial narrative. Her name survived, but her image faded. Not erased, not praised, simply recorded, quiet, distant, and enduring. After her death, Empress Shōtoku's name became a threshold few dared to cross. Her memory remained embedded in official records, but with distance, with restraint, and always with caution. Later, chronicles acknowledged her reign only through necessity, marking her succession, listing her policies, and noting the years she held the throne, but avoided giving her voice. Where earlier emperors were described with reverence or moral judgment, she was described with precision and little more. The emotional language reserved for rulers who shaped eras was absent. No edicts praised her foresight. No temple sang her sutras. And most notably, no woman would rule Japan again for nearly 1,000 years. Within a generation of her passing, female succession was no longer simply discouraged. It was structurally banned, not by one law, but by a cascading series of norms, edits, and genealogical exclusions that hardened into tradition. Her reign had not collapsed the empire, but it had frightened it. The fear did not come from rebellion or war. It came from what her rule had made visible, that a woman ruling alone, without heir, husband, or military council, could bend an empire into her design, that the sacred and the sovereign could merge, that religious authority, once external to the throne, could be drawn inward, manipulated, and wielded through loyalty instead of birthright. Dokyo was the most visible symptom of this fusion, and he was punished accordingly, exiled, erased from major chronicles, and left unmentioned in most later official histories. But the deeper rupture had come not from him, but from her. She had proved that succession could be controlled without marriage, that policy could be driven without consensus, and that absolute power did not require a male voice. To preserve the dynasty from repeating her, they closed the path behind her. And yet, despite the attempts to obscure her, much of what she built endured. State Buddhism, once a tentative partnership between court and temple, became embedded in governance. Even as later emperors worked to check monastic land ownership and reform temple authority, the centrality of Buddhist rites in public life persisted. The language of state power remained shaped by sacred forms. Imperial rituals framed in dharma, legal decrees referencing moral cosmology, and court ceremonies anchored in sutra recitations. The same structures that Shōtoku had used to sanctify her rule became routine mechanisms of legitimacy. Her transformation of the bureaucracy, shifting it away from clan-based inheritance toward religious and literate service, laid groundwork for a slow but decisive change in how state power operated. Merit, literacy, and ideological alignment began to matter alongside bloodline, and often in its place. She also left behind a version of the imperial institution that was more centralized, more formalized, and more detached from individual clans. Her reign showed that the throne could exist independently of noble consensus, that it could define its own reality, if only briefly. This possibility did not vanish with her. It remained a quiet undercurrent in later periods of reform and consolidation. Centuries later, emperors would once again seek to merge spiritual legitimacy with centralized authority, echoing the shape of Shōtoku's reign, if not its name. But her personal image did not survive the transformation. Unlike other rulers whose lives were mythologized, warrior kings, saintly reformers, or cultural patrons, Shōtoku's story was not adapted into legend. There were no epic poems that cast her in glory, no shrines where her spirit was honored. Even in temple histories, her contributions were often attributed to her father or obscured beneath institutional development. The woman who had once fused crown and altar was now a ghost in her own legacy, present in structure, absent in celebration. And yet, there is a shape to her silence. Every closed door to female rule bears her outline. Every law, written with Buddhist inflection, bears her logic. Every moment where court ritual turned from ancestral obedience to sacred symbolism bears her memory, whether named or not. Her reign forced the empire to confront what it feared, that legitimacy could come from will, not just birth. That a ruler could redefine tradition rather than be defined by it. And that once redefined, tradition never fully returns to its original form. Her rule did not end in collapse, it ended in control. A control so complete, it frightened those who inherited it. They responded not with revolution, but with removal, not with correction, but with forgetting. But forgetting is not erasure. Her legacy lived on, refracted through systems she helped forge, even as her name was spoken less and less. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?